He had asked the matrimonial agency in plain and careful language for a meek and quiet wife. Roscoe Keel stood on the platform at Nettle Creek Depot reading that very letter back to himself for the third time, as though rereading his own words might somehow rearrange the woman climbing down from the passenger car into something closer to what he'd requested. She was not meek. She was not by any reasonable measure quiet. She descended the steps with a squalling twin balanced on each hip, a carpet bag clenched between her teeth, and an expression that suggested she'd spent the entire 3-day journey composing a list of grievances she intended to deliver the moment her mouth was free. "Your Keel," she said, once the carpetbag was safely deposited on the platform. It was not a question. Beatrice Langley. "These are my daughters, Ada and June, and before you single word about the agency letter not mentioning children, I'll remind you the agency letter also didn't mention that you apparently expected a wife who'd agree with everything you said and never once tell you when you were wrong. I read the rancher's condition in the letters you sent my sister. You've got a leaking roof, a hired man who drinks, and cattle prices you're too proud to renegotiate. I am neither meek nor quiet, Mr. Keel, but I am considerably more useful than either of those things would have made me." Roscoe, who had buried one wife's meekness alongside her 6 years back and had convinced himself since that meekness was precisely what he wanted in a second, found himself entirely without a response. "Well," Beatrice said, into his silence. "Are we standing here till the twins catch a chill, or is there a wagon?" There was a wagon. The ride out to the ranch passed in a lopsided conversation where Beatrice narrated the entire history of her opinions on ranch management, child rearing, and the general foolishness of men who advertised for wives the way they'd advertise for a plow horse, while Roscoe gripped the reins and said almost nothing, partly out of habit and partly because he could not, if pressed, have identified a single gap in her logic worth arguing with. The house, when they arrived, did not improve his standing. Beatrice took one look at the kitchen, the dust furring every surface, the larder stocked mostly with salt pork and regret, and set her twins down on a rag rug with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd clearly done this exact assessment before. "This is the home of a man who has been surviving, not living," she announced. "I can fix surviving. Living takes a bit more effort from both of us, but I expect you're capable of it if you put your mind to something besides scowling." "I don't scowl," Roscoe said, scowling. "You've got a face built entirely of scowl, Mr. Keel. It's not an insult. It's an observation." She was already rolling up her sleeves, twins forgotten in favor of the stove, which she was inspecting with suspicion of a woman who expected it to fail her. "Where's your hired man?" "I'll want him hauling water while I get this kitchen fit for cooking in. Dell's off drinking, most like," Roscoe admitted, before he could think better of admitting anything to a woman he'd known less than an hour. "Then you'll fetch water yourself, and while you're at it, you can explain to me why a rancher who can't keep a hired hand sober is the same rancher who thought a meek wife would solve his problems, rather than a wife with the sense to tell him plainly what's going wrong before it costs him another season's herd." Roscoe fetched the water. He told himself, hauling buckets in the gathering dusk, that he was only doing it to quiet her, and knew, even as he thought it, that it was a lie he wasn't fooling anyone with, least of all himself. Dell staggered in near midnight, reeking of whiskey and unrepentant about it, and found Beatrice waiting for him in the kitchen with her arms crossed, and an expression that had, by all later accounts, sobered him faster than a dunk in the horse trough. She informed him, in terms that left no ambiguity, that a ranch hand who couldn't be trusted sober was a ranch hand who'd be looking for new work come morning, unless he mended his habits immediately, and that she'd be watching to make certain he did. Dell, who had worked for Roscoe 3 years without once being spoken to so plainly, mumbled an apology and was hauling water before sunup the next day without being asked twice. Roscoe, watching from the barn door, decided he was not going to be the one to tell her she'd overstepped, mostly because he suspected she hadn't, and partly because he'd never seen Dell move that fast for anyone. "You didn't have to handle Dell for me," he told her the next morning, more curious than critical. "I didn't handle him for you," Beatrice said, elbow deep in bread dough. "I handled him because a ranch that can't rely on its own hired help is a ranch heading for ruin, and I've got 2 daughters depending on this place same as you. If that oversteps some line you'd rather I respected, you're welcome to say so plainly, and I'll tell you plainly whether I agree." He didn't say so. he found, standing in the doorway of a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that he didn't mind the overstepping half as much as he'd expected to. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected nor, if either had been honest, entirely disliked. Beatrice ran his kitchen and half his household decisions with an efficiency that shamed his years of scraping by, and she did it while narrating every improvement in a running commentary of opinions he found himself, against his own stubborn instincts, looking forward to each evening. She corrected his bookkeeping, informed him bluntly that his last 3 cattle sales had been robbery dressed up as commerce, and reorganized his tack room without asking permission, on the grounds that a disorganized tack room was a hazard no sensible rancher should tolerate. "You argue about everything," Roscoe told her one evening, more bewildered than aggrieved. "I disagree about things worth disagreeing on," Beatrice corrected. "There's a difference. A meek wife would have let your roof rot another winter rather than tell you it needed mending before first frost." "I'd rather be disagreeable and dry than agreeable and drowning." He found unwillingly that he preferred her sharp tongue to any imagined meekness. A meek woman would not have caught the mistake in his bookkeeping that saved him a season's profit. A meek woman would not have stood in his kitchen at midnight, rocking a feverish June against her shoulder, murmuring fierce reassurances that had nothing soft about them and everything necessary. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to watch for the moments she'd turn her sharp attention toward him with something warmer underneath the wit. His neighbor Fenwick Cole stopped by one afternoon to borrow a plow blade and stayed longer than the errand required, watching Beatrice direct the reorganization of the smokehouse with the crisp authority of a woman commanding a small army. "Your agency letter," said Meek. Fenwick said, low enough that only Roscoe could hear, clearly fighting a grin. "My Dorothy is meek as a lamb, never says a cross word." "That's so," Roscoe said. "Also never once caught me shorting myself on a cattle deal, nor pulled my books straight, nor scared Dell sober in a single evening." Fenwick shook his head, something like envy plain on his face. Meek's overrated keel. "You got the better bargain, whether you asked for it or not." Roscoe hadn't any answer for that either, mostly because he suspected Fenwick was right, and he'd grown tired of being surprised by how often that was turning out to be true. The twins, for their part, took to him faster than either adult managed to take to each other outright. Ada, the bolder of the two, decided within a week that Roscoe's boots were the finest thing on the ranch and insisted on following him to the barn each morning in her own small pair, stomping through the mud with fierce 4-year-old dignity. June, quieter, preferred to sit on the fence rail and narrate his chores back to him in a running commentary that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her mother's. Roscoe found himself more mornings than not slowing his work to match a small girl's pace, and told himself each time that it was merely practical, not fondness, though he was becoming a poor liar even to himself. The turn came on a night in early autumn when a grass fire, sparked by a lightning strike 3 miles off, came roaring across the dry pasture faster than any man could outrun on foot, and the twins, who'd wandered farther from the house than allowed while chasing a barn cat, were caught between the flames and the creek with no clear path back. Roscoe was saddling his horse before he'd fully registered the smoke on the wind, but it was Beatrice who reached the girls first, running flat out across the pasture with her skirts hiked to her knees and no thought at all for dignity. Scooping both twins up against the smoke with a strength that startled even her, and wading them straight into the shallow creek where the fire couldn't follow. Roscoe found them there minutes later, soaked and coughing but whole. Beatrice standing thigh-deep in cold water with a daughter clutched in each arm, her sharp tongue for once entirely silent, replaced by the raw, shaking relief of a mother who'd nearly lost everything and refused to let it show until the danger had fully passed. "You could have waited for me," he said, voice rough with a fear he hadn't let himself feel until the danger was over. "I could have," Beatrice agreed, "but my girls were in the fire's path, and I wasn't about to stand meek and quiet on the porch waiting for rescue while they burned." "That's not the sort of wife you got, Roscoe Keel, and if tonight didn't prove to you it's not the sort of wife you needed, I don't know what will." He crossed the creek to her, boots filling with water he didn't notice, and took both twins from her arms so she could finally let her own shaking show, and when she did, he pulled her against his chest along with her daughters, the four of them soaked and smoke-stung and entirely, miraculously safe. Behind them the fire burned itself out against the creek's wet bank, unable to cross what Beatrice's quick thinking had already denied it, and the smoke drifted off grey and thinning against a sky gone orange with sunset. Ada, recovering her nerve faster than either adult, announced from within the tangle of arms that she'd like to go home now, please, and was hungry, which struck Roscoe as such an ordinary complaint after such an extraordinary fright that he found himself laughing, low and startled, into Beatrice's damp hair. "I wrote that agency letter asking for Meek," he admitted into her wet hair, "because I thought quiet meant peaceful. I know better now. The quietest this ranch has ever felt was before you arrived, and it wasn't peace. It was just empty." Beatrice pulled back enough to study his face, sharp eyes softened for once entirely of argument. "And now? Now I can't recall wanting quiet at all." Roscoe said, "I want this. Loud opinions and reorganized tack rooms and twins tracking mud through my boots and all. If you'll have a scowling rancher who was too foolish to know what he was asking for until it arrived on his platform." She laughed, water-soaked and smoke-stung and entirely herself, the sound of it carrying warm across the smouldering pasture. "I suppose I could be persuaded, Mr. Keel. Provided you understand I'll go on disagreeing with you regularly. It's who I am. Wouldn't have you any other way," Roscoe said, and meant it with the whole of a heart he hadn't known was still capable of wanting something this loud, this alive, this thoroughly, wonderfully un-Meek. They married before the first snow, in a ceremony Beatrice insisted on planning herself over Roscoe's mild objections, right down to the twins' matching dresses, and a guest list that included pointedly a sober and grateful Dell. The ranch that had once echoed with a widower's careful silence filled instead with twin footsteps, a wife's running commentary, and a rancher's scowl that had, somewhere along the way, learned how to soften into something that looked, on the rare occasion anyone caught him unaware, remarkably like a smile. Fenwick Cole, raising a toast at the small gathering afterward, allowed that he'd never seen a man so thoroughly and happily outmatched by a woman, and Roscoe, arm around his sharp-tongued, twin-raising, thoroughly un-Meek wife, agreed without a single word of argument.